We have the privilege of hosting Professor Bill Andrade, who's the director of the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy here at the University of Utah, and an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences here. Bill grew up hiking and camping in the Colorado mountains. He received his bachelor's and PhD degree from Stanford University, and held a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate and Global Change postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University. He's received a number of prizes from, among others, the National Science Foundation, which was an NSF Career Award. He also has received awards from the Packard Foundation for fellowship in science and engineering, and an early career fellow recognition from the Ecological Society of America. He's well versed in the topic that he'll be speaking to us on, and that's on the future of Western U.S. forests under climate change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Andrade.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Bob, for that kind introduction. Can folks hear me all right in the room? Fantastic. I'm going to walk around a little bit. I have a hard time staying behind podiums. I want to first just acknowledge and thank the Stegner Center for this invitation. I'm always astounded by the impact that the Stegner Center has had and is continuing to have in the environment and law and policy in the West. And as the director of the newly launched Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy, I absolutely view the Stegner Center as this model center to really illuminate how the best and brightest at the University of Utah can drive positive change and positive discourse throughout Utah and beyond. So it's a pleasure to be here. What I want to do today is just a quick first set the stage of some of the challenges that Earth's forests broadly face in the 21st century with a rapidly changing climate. I'm then going to zoom in to talk about a lot of the work we've done on the major challenges and risks that Western U.S. forests face from drought and other disturbance. And we'll talk about a lot of the modeling approaches and what the future looks like in our hazy crystal ball based on the models and the tools that we have to date. And finally, I'm going to wrap up with a newer section of our work, which is really trying to develop tools and make this cutting-edge science useful for decision-making and for the climate mitigation benefits that forests may be able to deliver. So of course, the context here is that on our blue-green marble floating in the vastness of space, driven by human emissions from fossil fuel combustion and some land use, we're running a massive planetary experiment. Temperatures are rising, and this is going to have profound impacts for society, is already having profound impacts for society, and it's going to have profound impacts for ecosystems. As Bob mentioned, I grew up in a small town in southwestern Colorado, near the San Juan Mountains. So these are the San Juan Mountains. And seeing the changes that happened in these forests within my lifetime is really what inspired me to become a scientist and set my course as a climate change scientist and ecologist. You can see these changes on most forest landscapes in the Western US, and here it's quite clear just in this photograph of we've got multiple types of dead trees in these landscapes. These are dying aspen forests. These are spruce trees affected and dying from beetles. Now, Western US forests and forests across the globe really are caught between these two opposing sets of forces. On one hand, rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can benefit plants. It can let plants do more photosynthesis and potentially grow more and continue to take up carbon out of the atmosphere. Right now, Earth's forests soak up about a quarter of the CO2 that people put up into the air every single year, and that dramatically slows down the pace of climate change. This is an incredible benefit to humanity. On the other hand, the stresses of climate change, drought, temperature, wildfires, pests and pathogens, to name a few, can sometimes overwhelm the benefits of CO2 and can drive this type of picture, widespread forest die-off events that can actually flip forests from carbon sponges to carbon emitters, and that could potentially accelerate the speed of climate change. Now, when and where these two sets of forces are going to dominate and what it means for Western US forests, this is one of the defining challenges of the field, and it's what my research group and many other research groups across the country and the world are racing to understand. So, does the future of Western US forests look more like this, which is Wolf Creek Pass in Colorado, where spruce and fir beetles have killed above 50% of the trees in this region? Or does it look like this, where we see a lot more growth and potentially more carbon storage in these forests at the end of the century? I want to highlight, in addition to, of course, the effects on our landscapes, on our economy, this is going to matter for the atmosphere itself and for the speed of climate change. So this is a graph showing you across a lot of our cutting edge ecosystem models within climate models about the change in carbon storage in the land in two different climate scenarios, a very low emissions scenario and a very high emissions scenario. And what I want you to notice is zero here means that's kind of no change. That's where carbon is today in our terrestrial ecosystems. Going forward, you can see this huge spread across the 21st century. And that actually, so the dashed lines are the range of all of these different models. There's about 34 of them. And the solid lines are the average across the models. But what I want you to highlight is, by the end of the 21st century, we see this immense range from dramatically more carbon locked up in Earth's ecosystems, which is primarily forests, to actual losses from forests and ecosystems globally. And this range, in terms of the amount of carbon, is dramatic. It can be up to 200 parts per million in the atmosphere, which is a little bit more than we've already increased today. So the future of Earth's forests will affect how bad climate change gets. Human drivers affect the future the most, though. Our decisions around energy and fossil fuel emissions are still the biggest driver, but forests can make our lives easier or harder. This is unfortunately no longer just model simulations. We actually are clearly seeing the impacts of climate change in our landscapes every single summer. My experience has been it's kind of hard not to drive or to drive any sort of mountain pass in the West and not start to see the impacts of climate change already, because we see them in our fire seasons, we see them in our landscapes of dying trees from beetles and drought, and we of course see them in a lot of our water resources. So what are the primary threats to Western US forests this century? I think the climate change threats or risks can really be distilled down to this triple threat, this three-legged stool of drought impacts, of pest and pathogen impacts, but primarily what we are concerned about most is beetle impacts and wildfire. And we're going to talk about each of these three today. So what my research group does here at the University of Utah is really try to tackle these three intertwined questions. How can we improve our understanding and thus our predictions of how individual trees respond to climate, using some fundamental understanding of plant physiology and of the ecology of forests? Second, how can we scale that from a single tree up to whole ecosystems, the Western US, and some of our work is global. And then finally, how can we leverage this improved understanding to build tools, data sets, and engage with stakeholders to actually inform decision-making around forests in a rapidly changing climate? One of the main ways that we're doing this right now is a large push around using forests as nature-based climate solutions, often through carbon markets. And I'll talk about that as we get to the end of today. So our scope really goes from the scale of individual cells and tissues. This is a snapshot of wood anatomy to measure how individual tissues and plants respond to water stress or temperature or fire, up to ecosystems using large-scale data sets like satellites and computer models, ultimately up to regional scales to try to develop these tools to inform decision-making. And I'm going to give you a couple pieces of each of these today, but I'm going to talk most about these larger scale projects. Okay, so we really, I think, over the course of the past 15 years or so, have worked a lot on drought impacts on Western US forests. And I've tried to distill it down to maybe 4 or 5 kind of main areas. We've worked a lot on the physiology of how trees die and why trees die, and what do those thresholds in mortality tell us. A lot of this has been in aspen forests, so I'm not going to show too much more on aspen today, but I'm happy to talk about aspen forests in the West. This is, as the state tree of Utah, it's something that's very near and dear to me. We've also worked to understand what happens after the stress, after the drought strikes. How much is there this effect that can persist in trees being damaged and not growing as well? And when and where can trees really recover from drought and get back to pre-drought conditions? This kind of dovetails into this next research question, which is droughts are getting more frequent and more severe with climate change. And especially in the southwestern US, we're seeing this already. So how do the effects of multiple droughts affect plants? And does that differ from just a single drought, which is what most of the scientific field looks at as single episodes? Finally, we've been trying to put some of this down into early warning systems. So if we know that a drought is striking today, or let's say this summer, can we actually issue forecasts or warnings of which forests and which trees we think are vulnerable to mortality or pests, and therefore we want to maybe make decisions around management? What I'm going to talk about as our first case study is actually how we incorporate this physiology, particularly this fundamental trade-off on these pores on leaves that control the water loss of the plant and the carbon uptake. This is work partially led by a former PhD student in my lab, Nicole Ziens. And what we've been doing is really improved the modeling of how these pores respond and how they are sensitive to different environmental conditions. And making that physiology really the baseline of our modeling tools to look at drought stress. So this is just an example of our performance in this model across 34 woody plant species, kind of showing you how open these pores are, from quite closed to quite open in our model and in our real world data. And we're able to explain about 70% of the variation in the real world data. And we feel fairly comfortable saying that we think these physiological models work remarkably well at this small scale. This is the scale of individual leaves. So the next question we wanted to tackle is, does that work at a tree scale? This was work led by a former postdoc in my group, Martin Venturis. And he did a lot of this research here on campus to put a bunch of different aspen trees under different drought conditions and ask quite simply, using this is a fairly complex cartoon of our computer model, but does this model that captures the physiology of these trees actually tell us how they're doing during drought stress? And that's what this rather dense figure shows us up here for a number of key pieces around plant performance, things like how much photosynthesis are plants doing, how much water can they move through their xylem to get up to the leaves. And here now on the horizontal axis is what we measured in this experiment, and what we, on the vertical axis here, is what we modeled. And you can see there's definitely variability, but we do a pretty good job across all of these variables at capturing the drought response at an individual tree level. So then the next step here is asking, can we take this same tool and test it across the Western US? Let's look at, can this same tool help us model tree mortality from drought for a bunch of different Western US tree species at these long-term monitoring plots. So this was the next step in this process. What we have here are about 10,000 long-term plots that the US Forest Service measures every 10 years. This is a network called the Forest Inventory and Analysis. And we have 8 dominant Western US species. I've got the common names up here, but you can see we have aspen, Colorado pinyon, Doug fir, a couple junipers, and a couple pines. What we did then was take weather data for the past 20 to 40 years and actually simulate the drought stress in our mechanistic model of how plants perform. And then we built these mortality statistical models to ask, how well can we do? Can we actually predict the mortality, or in this case, hindcast the mortality that we've seen in the past 20 years, going back to my early slide showing you some of the mortality around the West. Shows you, these maps show you the plots, and the red X's are plots where there has been substantial mortality, and they're kind of plotted over the top of the black X's, which didn't have substantial mortality. So you can see we've got quite a few plots and a number that have seen mortality. This is a bit of a good news, bad news type story. And the good news is actually using these set of models, we're able to explain mortality patterns decently well across the entire Western US. So here is the predicted mortality from our models, and this is the observed mortality. We explain about 52% of the variation, but you can see actually we're not doing so well at the high edges of mortality. And this is for all species considered together. It turns out when you dig into looking at individual species, mortality prediction from drought is still really hard to do. So let's look at each of these species. Here's this all species plot that I've shown you. But now if you break it out by individual tree species, our models don't look as powerful in explaining the observed patterns. For aspen, for example, we know there's been a lot of drought-driven tree mortality, but we're only explaining about 8% of the variation. It gets a lot better in Doug fir and lodgepole pine. And what's fascinating about that is there are drought impacts on those species, but a lot of the mortality has been driven by drought and beetles combined, or even more beetles than drought. We're not simulating beetles here, but yet just incorporating in some of this data around climate stress, we can do pretty well in explaining those patterns. There's a lot of things, models by necessity are inherent simplifications of the world. And so there are a lot of key processes that we know are not in these models, and yet are probably really mattering out in the real world at a regional scale. I think 2 of the key ones that I want to highlight are a lot of the water fluxes that happen below ground, water moving through the soil and access to water deep underground. And then those same beetles that I mentioned, these biotic agents that really do come in and affect and kill trees, which we're not considering directly in this set of tools. So this really prompted the question then from our group, can we start to model the risks of each of these triple threats? Actually, there's been a huge amount of fire modeling, and so we can draw on pretty established methods there for the Western US. But what we wanted to do was do US-wide drought and insect-driven tree mortality from the same set of plot networks. This was an audacious attempt. This type of thing has not been done at such broad scales and for all US forests. And so we gave it a shot. What we did for fire is we can use satellite data for the past 40 years and build these pretty simple statistical models of the area burned in a given region from things like what forests live there and climate data, how much precipitation, how much temperature, and how much drought occurs in a given month. For the climate, or really drought stress and insect stress, we're going to use the same Forest Service data set of individual plots measured from 2000 to present. And we built these statistical models where we have climate predictors, forest age, and this key piece of physiology, which is a measurement of how drought tolerant a given species is in its ability to pipe water. We then wanted to go into the future to look at these risks, and so we used 6 of these global Earth system models that we downscaled, meaning we used statistical relationships to get it down to a 4-kilometer grid. And we have 3 different climate scenarios. We go from a low to moderate emissions scenario up to a very high emissions, high climate change scenario. And then finally, we did an immense amount of model testing, cross-validation, comparisons, really trying to make sure that we had the most statistically rigorous models we could get. And we only made future projections when we felt quite confident that our models had very strong performance. So just to give you a sense, here's what our models do when trying to capture the past 20 to 40 years. So here on the right-hand column is what our models simulate for fire on the top, drought-driven tree mortality in the middle, and insect-driven tree mortality on the bottom. And then the left-hand columns are what come directly from the data. The case of satellites here on top for actual observed fires, and then this is tree mortality from the Forest Service plots on the drought and insect panels. I want to highlight briefly on this left-hand map, Wyoming is a gap in here because it was not in the Forest Service data set up through when this data was downloaded in 2018. So it's not that there isn't tree mortality in Wyoming. As folks who've been through there, there's a lot of tree mortality in Wyoming. It's just not in this data set yet. It's been added actually recently, so we can go back and start to fill in Wyoming. What you see overall, both in the observed data and in our models, is that fire risks are, of course, much higher in the western US and really, really high in California. That the drought and insect risks are really highest in the Intermountain West, which makes sense. This was a lot of the mountain pine beetle outbreak in Colorado through Montana. And on the drought side of things, we see these drought-driven tree mortality events like aspen, pinyon die-off, and a couple of these others. Here's our cross-validated performance for those who care about this, but I'd say the take-home is our fire models work really quite well. Our insect models work decently well, and modeling drought is still kind of the hardest piece for us to do. They work okay, but not nearly as well as the fire or insect models. Also worth pointing out that drought and insects often co-occur a lot, and that's because in many species, insects come in and kill drought-stressed trees, and drought weakens tree defenses. So there's a lot of co-occurrence of these two, and it's often not very easy to separate those two out. What killed an individual tree is not often that clear. Okay, so now we can go forward with these models and look at some of the projected future disturbances. I'm showing you a couple different regions, and then I'll show you the maps in just a second. But on the top is the fire burn area projections. This is the drought projections here in the middle, and on the bottom are the insect projections. The colors here are that red lines are high climate emissions, high climate change scenarios, and the green lines are low climate change scenarios. What you can see is fires we project to rise pretty dramatically in many regions and across actually almost all of the western US. And you do start to see some novel fires showing up in, and by here we mean moderate or severe fires, not the kind of low level fires, in some new regions like the southeastern US. Not surprisingly, drought impacts are really most dramatic in the southwestern US, which is, for a lot of what we looked at, really the Four Corners states and into Texas. And then insect-driven tree mortality, you see, does rise a little bit in the southwest, but is really dramatic on the west coast, particularly in California. Here's what the actual maps look like. So now, again, these same three columns are same three rows are fire, drought, and insects. And now we're going, this is the estimated disturbance at the end of the century from low emissions on the left to high emissions on the right. So think about this as a range of future worlds that we get to decide based on our carbon emissions. As you can see, fire, as you move from low to high climate change scenarios, has a huge increase. And this is quite consistent with many other studies. Drought, especially in the southwestern US, has a dramatic increase of tree mortality. And insects, it's really kind of the Rockies plus California that have some of the biggest increase in insect-driven tree mortality. Now, there are some important uncertainties to keep in mind, processes that we're not directly considering in these models. We're not directly considering land management, for example, or how disturbances interact. Our fire model's not considering the limitations of fuel. So when an area burns, it might have less fuel to burn for several years after. These are definitely uncertainties. The best evidence so far actually suggests that the fuel limitations are not likely to be that important, especially in the next 30 to 50 years, and even then don't play that big of a role through the end of the century. Happy to talk about that in questions. I think it's worth pointing out there's many reasons why these risk projections could be overestimates or could be underestimates. If I had to guess, I think our drought and insect models are maybe modest underestimates, and our fire models may be slight overestimates, but I think nevertheless, they're the best that we can do right now based on the data that we have. And finally, with the goal of really trying to make this cutting edge set of tools and projections useful, we partnered with a nonprofit called Carbon Plan to make all of this available on a web tool, which is really beautiful and fun to fly around. We tried to make it as easy as Google Maps, but just for forest climate risks. And we've, of course, made all the data and code publicly available if anyone wants to tinker with the models or use these data sets to inform decisions. So that's a nice bridge, actually, to my final piece today, which is how can we actually leverage this scientific understanding to inform decision making? I think it's probably clear to many of you, but there are a huge number of potential reasons why better science about the climate risks that forests face in the West can be helpful. Obviously, land managers really would like to know, to inform their management priorities, where are the fire risks? Which trees might be at higher drought risks? And what are some of the beetles we should be worried about? There's huge risks, especially with fire, but also with these other two, to communities and to infrastructure. So we did a paper last summer where we used these same models and we actually looked at the amount of property value exposed across the US to high disturbances in these different climate scenarios. And what we showed was actually going from a high emissions scenario to a moderate emissions scenario, we can avoid about half of the exposure of property values, billions of dollars of property values, to these three disturbances. So this can also inform planning efforts and development and what we want to be doing at the wildland urban interface. It will affect property values, and there's a really interesting hedonic pricing literature around that. Insurance companies really want to know what the risks are to communities, to ski areas, to infrastructure, to power companies. And I want to highlight there's both the direct risks of fire burning things, but there's also really dramatic remote risks and health risks through smoke in particular. So those first two categories we think quite a bit about, and we've worked on in various pieces. I'm going to talk next about this final category, which is using forests as what are termed nature-based climate solutions. the idea here is we know that forests currently take up about a quarter of the CO2 that humans put up. And there may be opportunities to change how we manage forests so that they can soak up more carbon and further slow the speed of climate change. This currently is almost entirely funded through carbon markets and carbon offsets, which have a whole suite of challenges, and I'll talk about a few of those. So what are nature-based solutions? A key part of this is a human activity. So these aren't just letting nature do its thing. This is a change in human management or human decisions, really around 5 main strategies, but these first 3 are far and away the most widely used. So first is just trying to avoid forest loss to begin with, avoid deforestation. Second is bringing forests back where they once were, or planting forests in new areas, and this has really captured a lot of public imagination in these tree planting campaigns that you've probably heard about. The third pretty broad category is called improved forest management, and this is really just changing forest management to try to increase the carbon in forests. It often involves extending timber harvest intervals so that you let trees grow bigger and soak up more carbon. Now, there are lots of reasons why there's a huge amount of interest in this. Obviously, one is that forests have these incredible co-benefits. They have all these biodiversity and habitat benefits, and all these benefits to society through ecosystem services. Clean air, clean water, tourism, a lot of these. And the potential to help tackle climate change and deliver some of these co-benefits has driven this enormous interest in making forests part of net zero commitments for governments and for companies, both the public and the private sectors. And just to give you a sense of the scale, one of the dominant ways through this in the private sector is through the voluntary carbon market, which has a value of about $2 billion currently. The vast majority of that is through forest-based carbon offsets. And it's estimated that could grow to $10 to $40 billion within the next 10 years. Now, there's some important catches here, which is that in order for nature-based climate solutions in forests to work, they have to do 4 absolutely key things. If they don't do these 4 things, they probably don't deliver for the atmosphere, and so they're not going to be effective. First, they have to cool the climate on net. Now, what does that mean? So trees obviously soak up CO2 from the atmosphere, and that does cool the climate. But trees also do other things, and they can reflect radiation back to space. And if you were to go out and plant a whole bunch of really dark conifers in a snow-covered region, or in an area with really dry and reflective soils, that change in just the reflectivity of dark trees where you once had bright snow can actually be bigger than the effects of soaking up CO2 out of the atmosphere. So there are regions, pretty broad regions of this world, where planting out a bunch of trees actually doesn't cool the planet, it can heat the planet. So you gotta be careful about that. Second, they have to lead to additional carbon storage. This basically means that any policy needs to have this effect from what would have happened otherwise. We can't just take credit for natural growth that was going to occur no matter what. Third, this is where it really gets into economics and policy. You have to account for the shifting of activities. A good way to think about this is if I protect forest here in Utah and it is moved to just be cut down next door in Colorado or in the Amazon, that hasn't delivered our climate benefits. All we've done is shift those activities to a different jurisdiction. And then fourth, and this is especially number 1, 2, and 4, this is where a lot of science can be brought to bear. We have to account for these climate risks, especially in a carbon offsets framework where you're allowing fossil fuel emissions to continue. Fossil fuel emissions stay in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. If we say, okay, company X can keep adding fossil fuel emissions to the atmosphere, and in return, we're going to protect this forest in California, which then burns down 5 years later, we've undermined our climate policy. We have to be able to quantify the risks and address those risks, meaning have an adequate insurance policy in place to tackle those risks for these to work. What are these risks? So this is what my group has been working on a lot in the past several years. There's two broad categories. There's ecological risks and there's social system risks. Ecological risks we've been talking about a lot already. Fire, drought, beetles, and other disturbances. The social risks, we can start to ballpark, but these are a lot harder to understand. The potential for a given project to fail financially, illegal harvesting or management failures. You can see policy or governance changes like in Brazil, if you change the administration coming in and suddenly the forest code isn't enforced and a lot of trees are cut down. So a critical test is, can we estimate the 100-year risk of these different threats to forests? And this 100-year time horizon is fairly arbitrary, but it's what the field has roughly settled on as a reasonable time horizon for permanent carbon storage. So what we know already is that the risks to forests in the West and across the US are non-stationary and increasing. They vary enormously in space. So this is showing you the 100-year integrated wildfire risk from the 1980s and 90s versus the 2000s through 2017. We can start to estimate these, and then we need rigorous estimates of these. And I would also really highlight, we need this publicly available and really clear, transparent, and reproducible tools and data sets. There's a huge need for open science in this space. So a couple broad questions we've been tackling are, how do these climate risks affect forest carbon over 100 years? Do different methods give us different answers about the future? And how can this information guide and improve policy like carbon markets? And actually, are there ways to fund the climate benefits of forests that don't involve carbon offsets? Because this makes our use of forests, I think, a lot more beneficial. I'm going to just jump in a little bit further, which is, we did an analysis here led by a postdoc in my group, Chao Wu, looking at, do we expect US forests to gain more carbon or lose more carbon over the 21st century? And we have three different broad approaches to do this. First is these large-scale climate models, which suggest carbon gains over most of the entire US. Second are these large-scale statistical models, which actually suggest a slight net carbon loss and carbon losses in some maybe non-intuitive places. And then this third class of model is what our group has really developed based on these, just the past project I told you about. And this model suggests some carbon gains in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, and mostly carbon losses throughout the Intermountain West to California. So where these models agree here are in the hatched areas. And in general, if I had to pick a future that I think is the most likely, it would be this panel B set of models. This is trained on the most data and is the most consistent with historical trends. If we overlay California's forest offset projects on that, here now, this is the same map and every dot is an offset project. We estimate that about 36% of the area in these projects is likely to lose carbon over the 21st century, and that's dramatically higher, sort of 2 to 5-fold higher than the insurance policy that this program has to date. We've extended this globally. This is the last data figure to show you, to look at forest risks across the globe here, where bluer colors are where we expect on average lower risks, and redder colors are higher risks. And you can see a lot higher risks, some in the Western US and North America, and other parts of boreal regions, and some higher risks in the Southern Amazon. So how do we take this science into policy? Just two quick concluding slides here. First, I think it's really quite clear that today's policies and programs, especially in the carbon markets, need more rigorous and data-based risk assessment. Almost all of these offset protocols massively underestimate the climate risks to forests. It's just a quick example, both in California and in the voluntary market, they have a 2 to 4% risk for fire across the US, whereas our analysis suggests that's above 30%. Similar story for drought and insects. Second, we really need clear transparency and accountability and the flexibility to account for new science. And I want to highlight here that there are many reasons that we should conserve and improve our management of forests, and carbon is just one. And a carbon offset approach may not be our best tool for getting a lot of these benefits. And so we've been exploring what are other mechanisms to do that. So to wrap up here, bridging across these scales from the tissue of how plants respond to water, temperature, and CO2, up to whole ecosystems is challenging, but we're making good strides there as a field. These nature-based solutions in forests really urgently need better data and better science around those 4 key pieces that I mentioned so that they actually work for the climate. Finally, the climate risks to Western US forests and the carbon they store is really quite substantial. There's a lot of uncertainty, and these risks are widely underestimated in our current policies. I see this as an enormous scientific call to action and an enormous need for these types of interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder processes. With that, I want to put in a quick plug. That is, some of the goals of the Wilkes Center is to bring cutting-edge science to bear on decision-making and to help scale up practical climate solutions. We're a new center on campus. We're excited to engage with all of you, and please do get in touch if you'd like to chat. 2 quick things to mention. We run 2 climate solutions prizes, a student innovation prize and a $500K climate launch prize, both of which are due at the end of this month. And we host an annual climate summit here on campus. The next one is planned for mid-May. We're going to be launching the website soon. So please do put that on your calendar and come check out. It's going to be focused on climate innovation and climate resilience. So with that, I want to thank my wonderful lab group and the group of scientists that I get to work with on tackling all these questions. This is all of us after about a week in the field in Colorado. And I want to thank my incredible collaborators and funding sources for making this possible. Thank you for coming. Happy to take questions.
Bill, thank you very much, and we appreciate your ending on a little bit of an upbeat note, especially with the prizes that the Wilkes Center is offering to get us all thinking seriously about climate change and how we address it. Before starting with questions, I should note, and should have noted earlier, that if you're interested in asking a question, you can join us and follow the instructions that are posted on the screen. We're using Slido. And if you see a question that you particularly like, you can put a thumbs up next to it and it'll rise to the top of the list of questions. I have got several questions from the audience, and I'll go ahead and start with the first one. Can you, and you've touched on this, but maybe you can touch on it a little further. Can you reflect about the ways that your research might impact real-world decisions that are made by federal land managers in Utah?
Yeah, this is something that we think about a lot. And so I think there are a number of possible intersections with land management decisions. First is really understanding where the risks are to forests, I think can inform a lot of management activities. So a good example here is, at least in some species and some ecosystems, some amount of reducing of fuels through things like prescribed fires or selective thinning of smaller trees can reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire and of drought and insect-driven tree mortality. Now, this isn't everywhere, it's only in certain systems. And so we've really been thinking about when and where can you apply some of the tools that we've developed and a lot of the great forestry literature for the past 30, 40 years to highlight, what are the priorities? Where, if we have limited resources and we care about reducing fire and building more climate resilient forests, where should we be prescribing fire? Where should we be thinking about timber thinning treatments? I think there are other uses too, thinking about fire moving into the wildland-urban interface and risk to communities and other stakeholders in these mountain forests. But that's probably the most concrete one, is thinking about the fire, drought, and insect risk.
Drawing upon some work that I'm familiar with, does this suggest how the Forest Service might think about approaching timber management and the types of trees that are harvested commercially, old growth versus young growth, that sort of thing, and how does that potentially play into the climate concerns?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's a bit challenging because it does vary a little bit from forest type to forest type. Generally speaking, a couple rules of thumb that emerge from our work and much other work in the field is that a bigger diversity in the forest, both in terms of the species present and the age structure distribution, is likely to help. What we don't want is a single age stand that's immensely packed of one species. And I think there is a lot of, on the fire side, from removing a lot of the smaller trees and understory fuels that can help in a lot of these areas that used to have historic low frequency burns. So, a lot of these pine woodlands like ponderosa pine, there's, I think, a big scope for that type of thinning and prescribed burns. Now, the challenge here, of course, is that the West is big and we have a lot of forests that need help. And so how can we really prioritize our top areas? I know the Forest Service is thinking a lot about this and we've been trying to help however we can.
Thank you. A second question. Can you tell us about what your models suggest about the future of the West and its forests? How much will climate change or not change that future?
Yeah, well, what is quite clear already is that climate change is already having dramatic impacts on Western U.S. forests. And as best we can tell, Western U.S. forests are on average losing carbon, mostly due to climate change. Climate change is really responsible for about half of the area burned in the West over the past 40 years and is exacerbating these drought and insect-driven tree mortality. Now, what we don't know is, very specifically, which regions do we think are going to keep forests and which are going to lose forests, and what species are going to be growing there? Are we going to see, some of these more drought-tolerant conifers be able to come in after aspen forests die? I think a general pattern that's quite clear is we're likely to lose a pretty substantial amount of forests, especially at low elevation. So what we really see is when drought kills trees and when fire burn trees, at low elevations, really kind of the lowest third right now of where species exist, you don't see much recovery on average. That those disturbances seem to be just knocking the forest off a cliff, and what is coming back is mostly shrubs or grasses. There's still a lot that we need to understand better.
Well, maybe you've answered the thought that occurred to me, which is there anything that accounts for the fact that that lower third is not coming back? Or
there is, and it's pretty clear that it's too hot and too dry. And so that really is that, we think of species having this niche of conditions that they can survive. And as climate change increases, that niche is moving uphill. And so these lower edge forests, it's just too hot and too dry for trees to come back in many cases.
The next questioner says, you use the phrase climate stress in explaining what's happening in the forests. Other than reducing greenhouse gases, are there management tools that policymakers could use to reduce climate stress on U.S. forests on a question is on a micro level?
Yes, there are actually some number of management tools to reduce climate stress. This ties into that last question quite nicely in that in some systems, reducing the density of trees can deliver this benefit for fire risk, insect risk, and drought risk. Insects really need the ability to spread from tree to tree, and having a densely packed forest facilitates that. With drought, a lot of it is around competition for water in the soil, and so removing some of the smaller trees and the understory use of water can actually increase the drought resilience of the surviving forests. Now, this doesn't apply universally, and I think the challenge is to be strategic, that we're not going to be able to treat anywhere near the amount of area in the West, so we've got to figure out where should we focus these activities. Really, the big two are what I mentioned already, mostly prescribed fires and some amount of forest thinning, Usually this is the sort of thinning from below approach of smaller trees and smaller fuels.
Yeah, am I correct that the thinning method works in some forest types, but not necessarily in others?
Yeah, that's right. And a good example here is aspen forests. So because aspen are a clonal species, you don't want to go in and thin aspens. Aspen really recover from a disturbance event that kind of clears out the entire clone, like an avalanche or a wildfire. And so thinning aspen trees actually is just not going to do a lot. They're going to not come back from that for a sort of plant hormone reason. You know, lodgepole pine is another example too, where it's not super clear that you should be doing that type of thinning. And so it really has to depend on the species and the fire and drought and beetle regime.
A questioner asks if you could talk more about the reason that modeling around drought is so difficult in contrast to modeling around insects and fire.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So our data sets around drought-driven tree mortality are less good than insect-driven tree mortality and dramatically less detailed and good than fire. So fire, you can see generally from a satellite, and that means we have 40 plus years of really good area burned, and to a lesser degree, the intensity and severity of a fire. Data here really helps us train our models, and the climate signal on fire is incredibly strong. Hotter and drier conditions drive fire spread and drive bigger fires. That we know quite well. Insects, you see this temperature signal, and hotter temperatures let beetles get more generation times in, warmer winter temperatures keep beetles from dying during the winter. Really cold winter snaps can often knock back beetle populations, which all goes to say there's a really strong climate level, and the Forest Service really attributes tree death in these plots quite clearly to beetles. You can easily see when a beetle has hit a tree and there are these pitch tubes everywhere from the beetle attacks. Drought is a lot harder to diagnose, so it's a lot harder to look at a landscape and say, or even walk into a forest and say, well, that tree died from drought and that tree died from beetles. Beetles we can see, drought is kind of the everything else, plus it's a lot harder to tease apart. So there's two things going on. We have less good data for drought, and the physiology is a lot more complicated. So that's I think the short answer.
Well, on the subject of drought and water more generally, we have a question. This may go a little beyond your talk, but and you can pass if you choose. But this is something that's come up before the Utah legislature recently. Could you address the concept of removing forests to presumably increase the availability of water for human consumption purposes?
Yeah. So this is something that as part of the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy, we dug into and addressed about a year ago as part of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. And there are a number of researchers at the University of Utah and at Utah State and at the Forest Service who have studied this for a long time. The big picture finding is in some systems, you can reduce tree biomass and get more water, but it's not clear that will happen in Utah and in the mountains here in the Wasatch. So it's really unclear that actually taking trees out is going to give us more water. The best estimates from similar studies we have in Colorado suggest it's about a wash, that taking trees out maybe doesn't lead to much more water at all, and it definitely affects water quality in a negative way. So it's not something we should count on as a very strong and certain way to deliver more water to people and to our lakes.
Thank you on that one. This ties in with an earlier question, but could you say anything further about the ability of mature and old growth forests to resist climate change risks compared to younger forests?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and there's still a lot more science to be done there. So I guess I would say it's a bit of a scientific unknown generally, but we tend to expect that mature forests are going to be a little better at weathering risks, especially if they have this kind of diversity of species and of age structure, and they are not completely full of understory fuels from fire suppression. So that there are these kind of layers of what these forests look like. Younger forests in some cases can dodge disturbance better. In aspen forests, we saw younger forests actually dodge drought a little better, but that was actually just the first drought. And then when the second drought struck, the younger forests started to die off at the same rate. And so it's not even clear in aspen whether older or younger forests are more resilient.
I guess I'm curious with the old growth forests. They are there's an endpoint in sight for the trees of dying of old age. Does that affect the calculation in terms of the value of old growth forests for climate purposes versus younger forests?
Yeah, it really doesn't affect the sort of medium-term horizon, which let's say is the next 100 years. A couple of reasons for this. So actually, wildly, trees don't age physiologically in the same way that mammals do. So bristlecone pines that can live 5,000 years are almost indistinguishable from a tree of that species that's a couple hundred years old. So what kills trees is not actually age or things like cell degradation and cancer, it's other things kill trees. So stresses kill trees, beetles kill trees, and to that extent, basically a lot of our Western US trees are nowhere near what we tend to think of as a maximum lifespan. It's really just more a statistical, what are the odds of something coming in and chomping down on that tree and killing it. So I don't think we worry too much about sort of senescence because trees don't senesce in the way that humans do.
Thank you, that's very clarifying. One final question. Can you discuss the role of biodiversity in forest health? Whether biodiversity and ecological resilience is typically incorporated into forest-based climate offsets, and when biodiversity conflicts with climate goals?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, so we have a broad body of literature that more diverse forests tend to be more resilient to stress. That, I think, is generally pretty clear. And we can see that in our landscapes pretty well, that having at least 3 or 4 conifer species is going to give us a better outcome than just a single lodgepole pine forest, for example. The offsets piece is fascinating. So some of these offset programs have some sort of benefits for more diverse forests. I think where this matters the most is in the reforestation and tree planting, that if we're going to go out and plant trees, we really want to plant a diversity of species, and we probably want to plant native species. The non-ideal case is really sort of the going out and planting a plantation of a non-native species like eucalyptus. It will store carbon, but it has this large trade-off of negative impacts on biodiversity and many, many other things. So there are some pieces of biodiversity in these offset protocols, but it's not guaranteed to increase biodiversity in most of them.
Thank you, Bill. Before we close, let me just mention again that on February 29th, the green bag topic will be political extremism on public lands. On March 14th and 15th, we'll host the 29th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium on the Energy Transition. And on April 10th, we'll host a discussion about a new book, Wallace Stegner's Unsettled Country, Ruin, Realism, and Possibility in the American West. Please join us for those events. Let me thank everyone who's here, both in person and virtually, for joining us today. And let me ask you to thank our speaker, Bill Anderegg, Director of the Wilkes Climate Center, for his presentation today.